In Chapter 2, we're going to now start covering some information about the U.S. economy, especially in our first section of Chapter 2, the 2.1 lecture. So let's go ahead and get to it. So what's this chapter all about? As we've talked about earlier, every country has to answer the three basic questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And each country has vastly different production possibilities because they have very different resources. They have very different labor force participation rates between men and women. They have vastly different amounts of education, training, and skill. So there's all kinds of differences between countries. So we're going to be taking a look at the United States in this particular case first in order to understand at least this economy. And why are we choosing this economy? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is it's the largest economy in the world. And number two, of the major countries, major meaning in size of their economy, it is a significantly pro-capitalist one. Even though, as I pointed out, it's a mixed economy, it leans toward the capitalist side. So understanding a capitalist society, the United States makes a reasonable example, as long as we understand that there's significant mixed in government-based systems as well. So, what does America produce? As I pointed out, we have a very large economy. It's the largest economy in the world as measured by the amount of goods and services it produces. It's also the largest consumer of goods. We specialize in producing what we can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries can. Of course, that's true for all countries. This concept of lower opportunity cost. This is a technical issue that we'll get into later. We won't do it now, but essentially, as long as you're going to be competitive, every country has to produce the thing at which it has a low cost of production. But what do we mean by low cost of production? As we've already described elsewhere, we recognize that cost is not properly just measured in dollars. There's other things that are also cost that aren't measured in dollars. So we need to make sure that we understand we're using the opportunity cost concept when we're talking about cost. And then, of course, we purchase goods from other countries. We purchase goods and services that we can either produce at a lower cost in the other country than we can in the U.S. And of course, that's true for other countries as well. That's not just an American issue. It makes sense to purchase things from other countries when they can do it cheaper than you can in opportunity cost. And then, of course, it makes sense for us to produce our own goods where we can do it cheaper. Now, let's take a look at some GDP comparisons. Now, the measure of an economy's size is the gross domestic product, which we usually abbreviate as GDP. Now, let's define it. As we can see on our slide, the definition is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders in a given period of time. So, the most important issue here is it's going to be the market value. We're going to find out later on when we get to a chapter down the road, we're going to get into a lot of detail on how you come up with the market value. But for practical purposes right now, we can see the market value, since it's not determined by any one bureaucrat nor by any one company, because the market price is determined by lots of companies and lots of consumers all interacting with each other. Economists believe it's the single best measure of the true value of something. So, once you add up the values of all the things that were produced, all the goods and services that were produced, you end up with a number that tells you what is the size of this particular economy. So the U.S. economy is about 1/5 of the world's GDP, meaning that the United States produces about 20% of all the goods and services produced in the world. The U.S. produces about 20% of it, and the U.S. economy is about 1.5 times larger than China's, as measured by the value of the goods and services that are being produced. Next issue. Let's take a look at a country's standard of living. One of the quickest and best methods for measuring the average standard of living of a country is per capita GDP. And all that means is we take the total economy, the total size of the economy measured in dollars, and then we divide it by the size of the population. And then that tells you how many dollars of goods and services were produced per person. Now, of course, not any individual person gets that much. Some make less than that, some make more than that, but it's the average of what people would make if everyone got the same amount of income. So let's take a look at some different countries. US GDP per capita in 2018 was $63,000, and in Germany it was $47,000. And Germany is the second highest country in the world in per capita GDP compared to the US. So you can see the US is somewhere around, $16,000 per person higher in the US than in Germany on average. Of course, not for each and every person. This would be true on average. Now, what about other countries? US and Germany are not the only countries in the world. Here's a nice list. We have the United States at 63,000, Germany at 47,000 roughly, Canada at almost 45,000, so Canada is pretty close to Germany, and then Japan at 41,000. These are referred to as wealthy, developed first world nations. Every one of them, even though there are differences between them, they are all significantly higher than most countries in the world. Another successful country in East Asia is South Korea, and they're at 30,000, so they're roughly a third below where Japan is, and about half of where the U.S. is. But worldwide, that is an amazing accomplishment, especially when you consider that as late as the end of the Korean War, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, and the Korean War ended in the 1950s. I was born in the 1950s. That means during one person's lifetime, South Korea went from one of the poorest countries in the world to being in the top percentile. Okay? We can see Saudi Arabia is next on this particular list. This is not a complete list by any means. There's over 200 countries in the world. So our author of our textbook has just picked out several interesting ones just based on the numbers. Saudi Arabia's, of course, is so high because they produce oil. So when you add in all the oil that's being produced at current market prices, the Saudis have a very, very large amount of economy per person. The world average is right around $11,000 per person. Russia is just below the world average. China is a little bit lower than that. And as you can see, compared to the United States, the average Russian makes roughly 1/6 of what the average American makes. And the same thing would be true for China. Now, unfortunately, the way this particular system is set up, the little thumbnail picture of me is hiding some of the poorer countries to the right. So please make sure you go look at that in the textbook itself. But you can see that these would be considered middle-income countries. Russia, China, Mexico, they are considered middle income. And then you drop down to significantly poorer countries like India, Nigeria, Haiti is the next one on this particular list. The incomes drop off quite dramatically in income per person. And we're going to try to understand that. Why is this true? Why are some countries relatively poor and other countries relatively rich? It's a pretty darn good question. And it's a pretty interesting one. I hope you'll find it to be interesting because it'd be really nice if we could get all the countries in the world at least up to the level of where Russia, China, and Mexico are per person. But of course, even better would be get them up to where South Korea or Japan or Canada would be a real significant accomplishment if it can be done. So we'll talk a good bit about that in later chapters as well. So right now at the very beginning of the book, of course, we're tossing out lots of ideas without actually diving into, well, how do you accomplish any particular issue. But I just want you to recognize that's how broad the difference in income per person is around the world.